Ayni. This is one of the different ways on how people greet in Quechua, an indigenous language spoken in South America. You might say, well, this is a fun fact, but how could I tell? But if we compare it with other languages that we might or might not speak, such as Spanish, French, German, or Chinese, we might know the equivalents. Hola, ça va, hello, ni hao. On top of that, on top of knowing those greeting words in these other languages, we know that those languages have robust communities of speakers, that they are relevant, and knowledge and innovation is being produced in those languages. However, when we think of Quechua and other indigenous languages, that might not be the case. And it's not a coincidence. I am from Peru, and when I was in school in Peru, most of the connections with Quechua, most of what I learned in school was in connection to the Incas, this vast empire in South America that built marvelous places like Machu Picchu, a space that maybe some of you have visited or would like to visit at some point. Wow, the Incas, this empire that built Machu Picchu, that spoke Quechua, that did amazing things. And if you're following what I'm saying, most of the descriptions are in the past tense. The Incas were great, the Quechua was spoken. We don't do that with French, with German, with Chinese languages. That rings a bell that sometimes we understand Quechua and other indigenous languages and cultures as a thing of the past. When in reality, Quechua, for example, is a language spoken by almost 10 million people. It is the most spoken indigenous language in the Americas. And by noticing that, or maybe just to put this in comparison, we're saying that Quechua has more speakers than Danish, that has similar amount of speakers as Swedish, that if Quechua speakers were a country, it would have more population than Puerto Rico or Uruguay. And of course, languages is not just about the semantics and the abstraction, but the speakers and the knowledge that is being produced in those languages. Therefore, overlooking these different languages and cultures is a way to also overlook people, communities, and knowledges. I would like to share a story with you. My mom's family is from the Amazon. And whenever we would go to visit my grandma, my cousins, my uncles, there was always this story of scientists going to the Amazon to find plants, to find animals, to collect data. And people would be very happy because they were coming from another country, mostly the global north. And people would share what they knew. They would collect the information. They would go overseas and maybe produce something in connection to healthcare or well-being without crediting these local communities, without recognizing their intellectual or royalties. And that's something that people know as knowledge extractivism. So just to do a quick recap, if we don't know about the languages, we don't know about the people. And therefore, we don't know on what people produce and create. Therefore, it becomes easier to don't recognize them, so they don't benefit of these spaces in society. A group of intellectuals, indigenous intellectuals, in order to combat that stereotype, coined this term, indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous knowledge systems are a way to encapsulate different practices and knowledges that indigenous communities from across the world foster, celebrate, and practice. Basically, is what we would call indigenous innovation. Sounds like very far away from just portraying indigeneity as a thing of the past, right? And then if we recognize that indigenous communities speak relevant languages today, that they are alive, and that they produce knowledge, then hopefully we will facilitate more spaces for those voices to be heard. Today, I would like to introduce some concepts in relation to that. One of them is Pachamama. Pachamama is a word in Quechua that the literal translation would be earth. However, a more deep translation would be Mother Earth. The word tells us, this word in Quechua, tells us many things. One of them is that it poses a relational dynamic with the earth, rather than only seeing it as a place where we grab things, that we use commodities for consuming, and that's it. Quechua philosophies highlight that we belong to the earth, that we are part of it, and therefore is a different understanding with our space. This is the abstraction part. And then it comes the practice, the Ayni. Because if we know that we can't do this on our own, then we need to look for ways for cooperation and for reciprocity. When people in the Andes build a house, the community comes together and they help each other. When people need to do the harvest, it's a collective activity. And therefore, the abstraction or the ontological definition of Pachamama as we belonging to the earth is manifested in the practices of reciprocity and collaboration. As we can see, is Ayni as a way to collaborate, but also as understanding knowledge, not only as abstraction, but as practice in the making, which ultimately leads us to decenter, and of course, recenter at the same time, indigenous knowledges, voices, and practices, to the benefit of those communities, but at the end, also to the benefit of everyone. And by saying that, I want to put an example, which is in connection to how the world innovates and how indigenous communities innovate. In this piece for the New York Times, I was able to share how big technological companies such as Google are expanding their languages services in indigenous languages. And that is a clear benefit as well for the communities who need more professionals and more services in those languages. Because again, people want to express themselves in those languages, wants to attend education, and they want to be able to keep the creativity in those languages. So, for example, the story of those scientists going to the Amazon can be a little different. So those scientists can recognize that there are knowledge keepers in those communities. So therefore, the dynamics and the way on how we produce progress and innovation changes in a more inclusive way. Therefore, we're thinking, we want to pose the idea of seeing indigeneity or indigenous issues not as a thing of the past, but as part of contemporary issues. Some of you might say, well, but I don't do particularly indigenous studies, or I don't work necessarily in the social sciences. But we all probably might care on issues like food security and recognize crops that have come from indigenous communities such as quinoa or maca or potatoes. Since the beginning of the pandemic, now we're having more conversations on the importance of well-being and mental health. And now people are more willing to explore and recognize other platforms of healthcare, such as indigenous healthcare and indigenous well-being. We just spoke about philosophy as well. And even we can explore spaces like entrepreneurship and conversations that are happening in our society, such as land acknowledgements, the re-understanding of our history. And of course, this is all part of the bigger conversation of fostering a fair society, about caring about social issues. Therefore, fostering for a diversity of traditions of knowledge means more innovation, but more inclusion. That's something we can all agree that we can all work together to make sure that we live in a better world. So next time that you hear the word Ayni, now you know that is a different way on how to greet in another language, in this case, Quechua. But most importantly, it's a way to be aware that indigenous communities, indigenous knowledges, and indigenous voices should be part of the global conversation of social justice, social issues, and innovation. Ayni, thank you.